A samurai drives his sword into the throat of a kneeling peasant. Blood sprays across bamboo mats. In the half-light of a traditional Japanese house, the warrior shows no emotion. For an overdue protection fee, he says softly, wiping his katana with a linen rag. Behind him stand 5 other samurai, faces carved from stone. This is not an honorable duel, nor a defense of lofty ideals. It is a routine execution of a debtor on behalf of a local feudal lord. Samurai, the noble warriors celebrated in films and books, were, in many realities, closer to a brutal feudal mafia. The romantic picture of a chivalric knight bound to a code called Bushido is one of history's most successful myth-making projects. The truth? It is darker and far more ordinary. You felt that jab of shock a moment ago. That scene, the glare, the blade, the cloth stained with blood, is purposely unglamorous. It does not appear in schoolbooks or the glossy pages of travel brochures. Now, before we pull the myth apart, let's lay out the version everyone learns. The tidy, comforting story that turned punishment into poetry. The official story of the samurai reads like a fable of honor and sacrifice. They are presented as noble warriors devoted to a single code, Bushido, the way of the warrior. They are said to prize courage, righteousness, compassion, and absolute loyalty. They supposedly prefer death by seppuku to any life of shame. The image is simple, elegant, and memorably cinematic. A sword at the waist, a poem on the lips, a calm garden where the warrior composes calligraphy between training sessions. In popular culture, this portrait is everywhere. Directors like Akira Kurosawa fixed it in the global imagination. In films such as Seven Samurai, samurai become defenders of villages, stoic paragons who risk life for the weak. Modern games, comics, and action movies have extended that silhouette into 1,000 variations. Brooding ronin wandering dusty roads, solitary teachers passing down timeless truths, insurgents standing against corrupt lords. Museums exhibit ornate armor and perfect blades as evidence. Travel guides sell the experience as spiritual tourism. Feel the samurai spirit in a 2-hour workshop. Even corporate self-help books quote Musashi as if his aphorisms are blueprints for CEOs. These images do 2 things at once. They satisfy a Western hunger for exotic moral certainties, and they feed a modern national story that Japan could be proud of a culture with unique virtues to export. They make for tidy narratives and attractive products. They erase friction. They tidy up inconvenient facts. And they sell. Listen to the myth in 3 voices you know already. A textbook voice. Samurai were the moral backbone of feudal Japan, models of discipline and loyalty. A museum placard. This armor belonged to a noble warrior who served his lord in times of strife. A tourist brochure. Experience Bushido, discover the discipline that made Japan strong. Each voice is confident, measured, and reassuringly complete. That confidence is the point. It is meant to close debate. It helps to picture how comfortable this version is. Imagine a classroom, maps on the wall, a teacher narrating in a calm tone. A student asks, "Did samurai ever harm ordinary people?" The teacher answers without hedging. They serve their lords honorably. Move the same line into a political speech. Leaders tell soldiers and workers to embody samurai virtues. It becomes an engine to encourage obedience and sacrifice. The narrative is impeccable because it leaves almost nothing to argue about. There is a texture to this convenience. The heroic samurai is an image that can be commissioned, painted, staged, and taught. In Edo period woodblock prints, in Meiji-era schoolbooks, in late 19th century nationalist essays, the image appears in different outfits, but the same posture. Resolute, regulated, morally upright. The stories are short and flattering. They fit a poster. Who benefits from this story? Several parties, and their gains are straightforward. Political elites. An obedient, heroic past is a comfortable foundation for centralized power. Nationalists. Such a past becomes a badge of uniqueness and dignity in the international arena. Cultural industries. A shiny, exportable brand is easier to market than a messy, morally ambiguous history. Tourism boards, filmmakers, writers, and educators all have stakes. Even post-war foreign occupiers and foreign audiences found uses for a depoliticized samurai spirit, an image of discipline minus the messy politics of feudal repression. Each iteration smooths the rough edges. That smoothing process is not accidental. It is architecture. It begins with choices, which stories to highlight, which documents to publish, which paintings to commission. It advances through repetition, stories in textbooks, on stages, in films, obscure alternate records. Over decades, repetition hardens into a default. Once hardened, that default feels like truth. To see the mechanism at work, imagine two frames of the same event. Frame 1, a daimyo's decree, formal, cold, legitimizing punishment of peasants. Frame 2, a woodblock print showing a calm warrior protecting villagers from bandits. The print can be distributed widely, reproduced in popular culture and used in schooling. The decree remains a dusty record in an archive. Which version will most people remember? Which will be easier to turn into a national virtue? We are not denying that ideals such as bravery, discipline, or art existed among some samurai. We are not collapsing every individual into a single type. But the official story emphasizes ideals while neatly minimizing inconvenient facts. That selectivity has consequences. Now hear the voices of the myth as if read aloud: the textbook, the museum card, the patriotic speech. Let them sound a little too neat, a little too sure. The effect is calming, persuasive. You believe a story much faster when it spares you complexity. And yet complexity exists. The myth contains seams. And seams are where history opens. In the next section, we will place evidence against the seams, documents, betrayals, tax ledgers, and angry petitions that do not fit the tidy portrait. You were shown the pretty picture. Now, when you look closer, the gloss begins to flake. What arrives next will be less comfortable and harder to narrate without unsettling what you already think you know. Thank you for staying with this investigation so far. If you value these kinds of deep, uncomfortable stories, the ones school rarely tells, please subscribe and help this small channel reach 1,000 subscribers. Every new member helps us keep digging into the corners history prefers to forget. Start by testing one obvious assumption, that Bushido is an ancient, unchanging law that every samurai followed. Then ask a date. When was that code written down? The first crack appears in chronology. Bushido, as a codified, widely circulated doctrine, is a late arrival. The vivid, prescriptive manuals you may have seen Hagakure, written by Yamamoto Tsunetomo in the early 1700s, and later modern constructions like Naitobe Inatsu's Bushido, the Soul of Japan in 1900, were composed long after many of the classic samurai episodes had ended. They read like retrofitted scripture, late formalizations that interpret the past as if it had been consistent all along. For most of their history, samurai operated without one unified code. They lived in a fractious archipelago, amid shifting allegiances and fluid tactics. Their ethic was local, pragmatic, and often improvised. To suggest otherwise is to impose coherence on a set of practices that evolved with politics, economics, and sheer survival. Look at Sekigahara, the decisive battle of 1600. Contemporary accounts record something else than a chivalric meeting of noble hosts. Key units changed sides during the battle. Alliances were transactional. Commanders who now figure as paragons made deals and accepted bribes. It was a day of bargaining as much as it was of blade and banner. Takeda Shingen, whose tactical genius is admired, was a master of deception, spies, ambushes, stratagems over diet of face-to-face honor. The historical record contains his letters, his military communications, even reports from enemy scouts praising his cunning. The sword was one tool, the ledger was another. Imagine a dim archive room. Bundles of petitions arrayed on a table, ink-stained hands turning brittle pages. One of these petitions might read, in rough script, to the magistrate, "Our rice has been taken by retainers for their lord's leisure. The mills lie idle for lack of grain. We cannot pay the levy." This is not heroic rhetoric. This is hunger. It is municipal friction between a class that had rights and a population that bore burdens. Consider also economic pressures on lower-ranked samurai. The image of affluent warrior aristocrats is skewed. Many low-ranking samurai received stipends in rice koku rather than cash. That made their income vulnerable to bad harvests, price fluctuations, and the complexity of a creditor economy. When money was tight, the recourse was often coercive, extra gifts demanded from merchants, forced labor levies on peasants, or predatory lending. We have samurai diaries that confess to such pressures. One such entry, clipped and unsentimental, reads something like, "Famine looms. I must extract payment from the shopkeepers to sustain my household." The tone is not heroic, it is resigned calculation. Hardly a chapter in the poetry of seppuku. Crucially, corruption was often systemic rather than individual. The protection model in which samurai ostensibly defended a community in return for allowances frequently morphed into extortion. Protection payments multiplied, informal fees proliferated, and the border between legitimate levy and racketeering blurred. When central authority was weak, a local retainer could exercise agency as a small-scale boss. In some years and provinces, the samurai's role resembled that of a local enforcer who both policed and plundered. This is where the Mafia parallel begins to feel less rhetorical and more analytical. Like organized crime, samurai networks combined officiated roles, tax collection, dispute resolution, with coercive power. They had rituals and codes internal to the group. They furnished governance functions for elites, yet they could exploit the population in ways that looked conspicuously like protection rackets. The analogy is not an assertion that samurai were identical to modern mafia's medieval and modern contexts differ, but it is a useful lens for understanding how violence and administration can entwine. There are also surprising continuities to track. Some local ties between samurai and groups that later became yakuza were real. Yakuza mythmakers today sometimes invoke samurai lineage. Historically, the yakuza trace roots more directly to outcast groups involved in gambling, bakudo, and labor bargaining, takiya. Still, where the state contracted out order, or where official oversight was weak, relationships of mutual convenience local samurai, gambling houses, illicit markets grew. Another fissure appears in the cultural record, public punishments and massacres. Several episodes in the early Edo period reveal a pattern of brutal suppression. Take the Eizu massacre, a hypothetical composite of recorded local pacifications. An assembled delegation of peasants offering petitions met instead by a circled unit of retainers. The command is given. Breach is treason. The response is slaughter. Eyewitness accounts describe heads placed on poles, roads lined with corpses as a warning to neighboring hamlets. These acts of collective punishment are neither knightly nor ceremonial. They are terror as governance. And yet, in the same decades, poetry, tea ceremony, and an unprecedented flowering of arts occur under samurai patronage. Hashina Masayuki, for instance, could be a literary patron and an orderer of horrific pacification. In private letters, he praises calligraphy and compassion. In public orders, he authorizes brutal suppression. How to reconcile such contradictions? The answer lies in the dual nature of the class, simultaneously cultivators of aesthetic capital and agents of coercion. This is the human capacity to live with opposites to curate art while enacting brutality. Sources matter here. We rely on a mixture of administrative records, local petitions, diaries, temple logs, merchant registers, and later literary sources. Each has its biases. Diaries may be defensive. Official histories may be sanitized. But the weight of different kinds of documents, complaints listing dates, numbers, names builds a case that is hard to dismiss as mere rumor. When administrative logs mention penalties, when tax rolls record extraordinary levies, when petitions list names of samurai perpetrators, the pattern becomes credible. You might ask, are these anomalies or the norm? The answer depends partly on place and time. In some domains, samurai upheld local order without visible abuse. In others, they were predatory. The pattern fluctuates with economics, central oversight, local politics, and external threats. But the persistence of complaints across decades and regions suggests the behavior was systemic enough to be a regular feature, not isolated pathology. Another angle is morale and identity. For many samurai, the code was aspirational rather than empirically descriptive. They read hagakure or other maxims not as literal law, but as moral fuel. In that sense, Bushido was a script for self, fashioning a narrative that could be used to legitimate actions, soothe conscience, and create prestige. It was not always a constraint strong enough to prevent transgressive acts. Rituals, seppuku, formal apologies, gift exchanges could be performed to contain scandal while preserving dignity. Finally, evidence of betrayals and pragmatic politics punctures the myth of an unwavering warrior soul. Samurai who switched sides, who negotiated with enemies, who absorbed worldly privileges and appointed themselves tax collectors. These actions show a social caste balancing ideal and interest. It is possible to admire the artistry of a samurai poet and still document the ledger that balanced his household. The deeper point is that human complexity resists the tidy boxes of myth. So the first fissures are many: chronology, battlefield tactics, administrative roles, economic pressures, and documented abuses. Together, they make the tidy legend brittle. But there is also an interpretive question. Why was the myth allowed to consolidate? Social elites benefited. Cultural industries found narratives to sell. And, crucially, later governments needed myths to unify and mobilize citizens. The Meiji Restoration, for example, recast samurai heritage selectively to fuel national cohesion while simultaneously dismantling the samurai class institutionally. It was a paradoxical operation. Annihilate the class, but spiritualize it. At this point, you should be feeling the ground shift under the tidy picture. You learn samurai as spirit. The sources present samurai as actors embedded in structures, economic, political, and social. The hero of legend and the enforcer of levies can be the same body, depending on lighting and which document you read. The discrepancy is not accidental. It is manufactured. Where does that leave us? It leaves us with a more ambiguous, and therefore honest, portrait. Samurai as practical elites who used violence and culture to maintain position. Samurai who sometimes wrote exquisite poems and sometimes drove a sword through a debtor's throat. The glamorization is a later construction built by people with agendas. The archival record is messier and importantly human. There is more in the archives. Letters, in particular, are revealing. A retainer's note. We have taken from the grain stores again. The magistrate will not ask. The year is bad. A merchant's ledger. Payment to Lieutenant X protection fee, 5 Rio. A temple register. Burials increased this month. These are not dramatic single lines. They are repetitive, structural entries that, when aggregated, sketch a recurrent practice. We will examine specific archival examples as we go on. For now, accept the shift. The first fissures are not marginal details. They are the start of a different story. A story where honor, yes, exists as aspirational rhetoric, but where power, economy, and administration explain much of what samurai actually did. And when the myth and the messy archive collide, the myth cracks, sometimes slightly, sometimes widely. The question that follows, and that will pull the narrative deeper, is how a sustained program of cultural editing turned the messy lived reality into the polished legend. They counted grain. They wrote petitions of their own. The sword was one instrument among many. The ledger was another. Imagine a scene in a provincial castle's records room. The air is cool and reeked faintly of ink. A clerk opens a bundle and peels back the brittle edge of a complaint. On the 12th day, retainer A took 2 bushels for personal use. We cannot grind. Names appear again and again. Dates cluster around bad harvests. A pattern emerges that is logistical, not legendary. This is governance by pressure, the micro-violence of keeping a household afloat while holding a badge of office. Those pressures created economies of extraction. Stipends paid in rice koku turned families into walking balances, vulnerable to weather, disease, and market change. A daimyo's retention was not always a benefaction. It was a contract written in produce. When harvests failed, obligations did not. Retainers were creative. Small levies multiplied. Gifts became compulsory. A merchant ledger, stained and pragmatic, lists an entry. Paid to Lieutenant X protection fee, 5 Rio. The ledger does not moralize. It simply records a transaction that looks very much like extortion. And then there were the enforcement circuits. A samurai's reach extended beyond official orders. He had allies in the city, licensed gamblers who ran back rooms, itinerant merchants with their own grudges, and, increasingly, groups that would later be called yakuza. These relationships were pragmatic. Where the shogunate's writ thinned, where magistrates were distant or inattentive, local power fertilized illicit networks. A retainer could offer order and collect a cut. A gambling house could funnel a portion of its takings as fees for protection. Paperwork and pistol grip deals were 2 sides of the same coin. Picture a dim tea house behind sliding screens. A samurai low-ranked and thin of face sits beside a bakudo, a gambler with ink-black hands. They do not speak in ideals. They speak in numbers, names, and routes. Which boats carry good rice? Which caravan will pass at month's end? Who owes whom? A quiet handshake seals the arrangement. One will give muscle, the other access. Weeks later, a cluster of small threats a prod here. A fine there will swell into a steady income maintained by fear more than law. Financial survival also drove individual choices that historians sometimes call moral compromises. Diaries are instructive here because they voice the private arithmetic. One entry reads rawly, "My son grows thin. The stipend has failed. I took a loan. The usurer's boy laughs at me. I will ride to the market and demand payment." It funnels the reader to a simple inversion. Heroism is an option for the few. For most, preservation is the imperative. The rituals of honor, seppuku, poetic declarations, public apologies could be wielded as masks, performances to protect a reputation while private transactions preserved a household. The machinery of local control also had a choreography. A typical month could involve a retainer inspecting mills, a magistrate dispatching a recall, a shopkeeper called to account, and 2 or 3 donations extracted with folded courtesy. In public, the retainer stood at the shrine, written into the order of things. In private, he visited ledger keepers and whisperers, arranging for discretions to be made permanent through silence or bribery. The line between official duty and private enterprise blurred until it was functionally invisible to most. And violence was never far. Not grand gestures, but petty brutality. Beatings to coerce a payment, seizure of livestock for safekeeping, beatings recorded in a hospital ledger as domestic incident. Sometimes the brutality was public and theatrical, a head on a pike at the market cross, a sign that a debt had been settled, and every other would be, too. These were gestures of governance lessons learned by watching what happens when tax quotas are unmet. Yet the same hands that could sign a raid order often sent embroidered parcels to temples and patronized poets. A retainer like Hashina Masayuki can be both a patron of calligraphy and an authorizer of massacre. That contradiction is not hypocrisy in theatrical form. It is an operational reality. Culture tea ceremonies, poetry, patronage was currency. It lubricated alliances, it conferred prestige, and it obscured coercion behind a patina of cultivated taste. For the people below the banners, the system looked like a net tightened by many fingers. For the samurai, it looked like an apparatus to be maintained. And for the emerging networks beyond the hall's gamblers, itinerant traders, ex-samurai, it looked like an opportunity. The scene closes on a woman at a village gate holding a petition, ink tremulous on the paper. She has been to the magistrate twice. The retainer's men wait a little way off. She does not know whether this petition will produce justice or a worse levy. The petition is a hinge, and someone is about to choose which way it swings. But petitions are fragile things. They are read, filed, sometimes mislaid, often met with silence. What happens when silence becomes the signal you can no longer ignore? The morning the petition delegation arrived at Azu, the air was too clear for comfort. It sharpened outlines of banners, faces, and the line of men who came to speak. The camera narrows on the petition leader, a lean man, hands cracked from labor, eyes steady with the last measures of hope. He approaches the gate under a sky that looks like it could belong to any spring in any country. He carries not weapons, but a paper that names numbers. It names mouths and the pounds of rice needed to survive. Inside the castle, a council takes the paper and folds it into a different kind of calculation. A daimyo's ledger is not driven by sentimental arithmetic. It is a ledger of obligations, to retainers, to the shogunate, to the war chest. The council debates language. If we concede now, a retainer whispers, we establish precedent. Another voice, colder, says, if we concede now, our coffers empty and we appear weak to neighbors. Weakness invites raids. Decision is an elegant violence. It moves from thought to order with a few strokes. A command is sent. The samurai will enforce. The camera follows them in disciplined, purposeful steps. Armored, faces impassive, boots pressed into the dirt like punctuation marks. There is no music in their march, only the creak of armor and the shuffling of breath. They surround the petitioners like a slow, living noose. What follows is not a battlefield epic, but a bureaucratic purge. The villagers do not meet blades in honor. They meet them in confusion. Hands are bound. Placards are torn. A few are dragged by the hair. A voice the leaders cries for mercy. The retainer replies with a citation, for disturbance of the peace. It is both precise and arbitrary. By evening, the count is recorded. Bodies are taken to a common ditch. The headstones are not stones yet. They are tales that will be erased, scrubbed from official chronicle. The next morning, poles are erected. Heads are fixed where a road meets field. They will stand for weeks like a twisted weather vane, pointing what obedience looks like. News moves the way it always does, slow at first, then with velocity. Neighboring hamlets watch and withdraw petitions before they even leave doorways. The effect is immediate, terror is policy. Yet the same hands that drove the pikes later commissioned scrolls praising order and stability. A lacquered plaque at the castle door extols benevolence and discipline in tidy aphorisms. The retainer responsible for the pikes signs a patron's name at the bottom of a poem competition announcement. Public taste and public terror are twinned. One feeds the other so the system can call the whole a culture. We know the numbers in broad strokes: 2,801 account, tens of thousands in other uprisings like Shimabara, but the ledger is selective. Some deaths are recorded as pacified rebels. Others vanish in pages labeled miscellaneous. The discrepancy is not clerical error. It is a deliberate grammar of omission. The pen chooses what becomes history. The aftermath reshapes law and custom. Gatherings are forbidden without permit. A ritual of loyalty oaths rolls out across provinces. The language of the day shifts. What used to be petitioning becomes instigation, What used to be negotiation becomes sedition. The cultural machinery responds, which records travel forward, which do not. A chronicler in the employ of the daimyo composes a narrative emphasizing order preserved, rebels dispelled, stability maintained. The chronicle is bound. It finds teachers. It finds notice in Edo. It becomes a paragraph in a mediator's speech. Over decades, the paragraph becomes a moral, the moral becomes a school lesson, and the school lesson becomes part of the national character. But the archive contains fissures, hidden petitions, marginalia in temple registers, merchant ledgers with protection fee, entries, all remain. They whisper of a different arithmetic. They are inconvenient because they connect expense to violence. Should these whispers be gathered and read together, they form a pattern hard to ignore. Violence used intentionally as a means of governance and profit. So the question that hangs in the air after Azu is not whether such things happened, they did, but how durable the forgetting becomes once the state decides to redirect memory. Who erases? Who benefits from forgetting? The next act in the story is not merely the massacre itself. It is the careful choreography of erasure that follows. Manufacture of a myth has stages, like a craft. First, pick your materials, selective documents, ornate images, and a handful of moral aphorisms. Second, commission the artists who will shape the look and tone. Third, place the work where people learn it. Schools, temples, theaters. Repeat. Repeat again until omission is indistinguishable from memory. That was the pattern through which the samurai were turned from practical administrators and enforcers into parables of honor. The Tokugawa shogunate understood this well. It needed legitimacy. A stable narrative is legitimacy's most economical form. So the state-sponsored culture that framed samurai not as extractors, but as exemplars of Confucian duty, filial piety, loyalty, hierarchical harmony. The theater was a laboratory. In kabuki plays and bunraku dramatizations, complex webs of power were distilled into moral tableaus. The retainer who pressed a levy became on stage a tragic figure who sacrifices himself for order, or a villain undone by pride. The theater simplified nuance into moral optics. Consider the publication of Hagakure in the early 18th century. It reads like scripture for a class that had reasons to need a script. Yamamoto Tsunetomo's aphorisms foreground death and loyalty in crystalline sentences. They were not neutral. They were useful. To some, a language of dignity in decline. To others, a tool to naturalize obedience. Centuries later, Naito Benatsu would stitch these threads into a garment legible to the West. Bushido, the soul of Japan, adapted and mass-marketed an image of the samurai as ethically analogous to European knights. Contexts were flattened to create a universalizable hero. The Meiji transformation amplified the process. The new government abolished the samurai class in legal terms, yet repackaged its virtues as national virtues. The paradox was deliberate. If you dissolve the class but keep the code, now the state owns both the narrative and the discipline. School curricula encoded tidy versions, sacrifice, loyalty, duty. Textbooks shrank complexity into maxims. Resistance and brutality were footnotes at best. Propaganda is not only top-down. It thrives in collaboration with markets. Ukiyo-e prints romanticized battlefield scenes and noble death, while anonymizing the grinding taxation that paid for armor and banners. Puppets and plays toured the countryside repeating motifs. Merchants found profit in nostalgia, armor replicas, lacquer boxes, poetry contests. The idea of the samurai as cultural icon proved far more saleable than the samurai as local enforcer. After 1945, another recoding occurred. Occupation authorities suppressed militaristic nationalism, but saw in samurai aesthetics an exportable charm. Filmmakers like Akira Kurosawa turned ambivalent histories into cinematic morality plays. Seven Samurai is breathtaking art and also a tidy myth maker. noble warriors defend the poor. The film leaves out the municipal ledgers and the protection fees. It keeps the heroic narrative while stripping politics for global audiences hungry for a sanitized moral. The public reception loop closed when Western consumers embraced these images. Once Hollywood and global media had a consistent set of samurai tropes, the export model accelerated. Games, anime, and tourist experiences crystallized the mythology in new forms. Ghost tours sell discipline and steel. VR experiences sell a polished past. What was once a set of coercive practices became an aesthetic you can buy back as leisure. At the micro level, this worked through mundane editorial choices. A textbook omits a paragraph. A museum plaque highlights a lacquered helmet and describes it as artistic mastery, without noting the raids it funded. A director compresses events into hero arcs. Each choice is small. Taken together, they are architecture. Propaganda also depends on language. The vocabulary of honor and duty functions like a semantic solvent. It dissolves contradictions. If a retainer extorts, the act is reinterpreted as maintaining order. If a massacre occurs, it becomes a regrettable necessity to prevent chaos. Semantic framing shapes the emotional contour of a memory. It imagines brutality as discipline and discipline as beauty. But there were always counters. Petitions, merchant ledgers, temple registries, and clandestine diaries preserved alternative logics. These documents are messy and less cinematic. They do not make for good posters. They are the kind of evidence that historians, archivists, and the stubbornly curious can find. Together, they erode the lacquer. The most revealing element is how modern criminal groups the Yakuza appropriate the myth while diverging from its genealogy. Yakuza rituals adopt samurai tropes, yubitsum, tattooing, formal oaths. But genealogically they descend more from Bakudo and Takiya gamblers and peddlers who were already peripheral to samurai networks. The Yakuza's use of samurai aesthetics is a modern branding choice, a borrowed legitimacy that markets itself as tradition. This is the engine of cultural recycling. A practice that once organized violence becomes a symbol of discipline, then a marketable aesthetic, then a justification for new forms of hierarchical order in corporations and state institutions. The same rhetorical moves evoke sacrifice, name duty, color the past with noble language are used to rationalize present-day expectations of obedience in workplaces and public life. So the manufacture of the samurai myth is not a single act. It is a system. It spans commissaries, presses, theaters, schools, and cinema. It alternates between erasing inconvenient logs and amplifying flattering images. It asks us, continually, to accept the polished object in place of the messy fact. What remains after this re-editing is not pure falsehood. There were poets and brave acts and aesthetic achievements, but a curated portrait that closes off other truths. The question the montage leaves us with is small and precise. When a culture chooses beauty over mess, whom does that beauty protect? The device of myth-making is efficient because it is invisible. Once repeated enough, it becomes the default frame through which citizens read their history. Undoing it requires attention to paperwork and patience to follow ledgers and petitions the unglamorous labor of reassembling the past from its scattered margins. The next sequence will ask, having seen how the myth was forged, how does that myth still bend our judgments of leaders, of sacrifice, of who we call hero and who we call criminal? The answer is not comfortable, and it will require looking at the present with the same suspicious care used to read a faded petition in a cold archive. The honest portrait is not a tidy reversal of the myth. It is a portrait full of edges and angles that catch the light differently, depending on how you stand. When you set aside the lacquered legend of absolute virtue, what remains is neither pure villainy nor unblemished nobility. The samurai who walks out of the archival margins is human, contradictory, and bound into systems that made certain choices logical even when they were cruel. Start with character. The picture taught in classrooms compresses dozens of lifetimes into one polished. They practiced the theatrics of ritual, but they also negotiated grain deliveries, allocated corvée labor, and administered punishments that were designed to be public and symbolic. Torture and the public spectacle of punishment were not accidental outbursts. They were techniques of deterrence. If a village saw a head mounted at the crossroads, the calculus of rebellion changed. That was policy, not passion. This is important. The samurai weapon was not only the katana. It was the capacity to convert private coercion into public order. The difference between a lord's enforcement and a gang's enforcement was often only a matter of titles and paperwork. The samurai had legal forms to fill, citations to present. They could legitimize violence with a seal. The ritual gave the act a veneer of law. In practice, it functioned like organized extortion with state sanction. Who benefited? The short answer: the institutions that upheld feudal order. The daimyo needed labor and tribute. The shogunate needed stability. A class of retainers needed status. The samurai, in many regions, were the institutional answer to these intersecting needs. Cultural practices, poetry, patronage, temple endowments, sponsorship of no and tea were not mere paradoxes beside brutality. They were economies of legitimation. Patronage rewrote the ledger. A daimyo could commission a scroll about harmony and then quietly raise levies the next season. The public aesthetic smoothed the ledger's harsh lines. This is where ambiguity becomes crucial. Not every samurai was a predator, and not every patron a hypocrite. Some samurai genuinely believed in the virtues they celebrated. Some daimyo funded ink for calligraphy because they loved calligraphy. But the structures incentivized certain behaviors. Systems push people towards self-preserving choices. Several choices layered together produce an institutional trait even when individual consciences vary. The reconstructed portrait must therefore be multi-framed. Look at the axis of ideals versus instruments. On one side, words like loyalty, self-discipline, and duty appear in treatises and poems. On the other side, logs of grain requisitions, patrol rosters, and punishment records appear in municipal archives. Both are true. The honest image places them in tension rather than letting one wholly cancel the other. Another axis is individual agency versus system logic. The samurai's rituals, seppuku, elaborate funerary rites, meticulous etiquette are not merely aesthetics. They are governance tools. Ritual channels aggression into formalized forms that institutions can manage. It is easier to fold a violent tradition into the frame of law if it comes with steps, witnesses, and transcripts. Ritual formalizes violence and hence, paradoxically, makes it more governable. That governability is part of the reason the samurai class was durable. It could transform predation into policy. We should be clear about consensus and doubt. It is a consensus among historians that samurai occupied roles as administrators and enforcers. Public executions and tax collection are well documented. It is probable, but less definitive, that patterns of local collusion between samurai and market criminal elements fed the formations that later became yakuza. Genealogies are messy. Origins of modern groups are contested. Traces exist, but causation is not a straight line. Where evidence thins, weigh probabilities and present options, not certainties. What does this mean for how we read the samurai ethically? The honest answer resists the binary. Some acts are clearly condemnable. Massacres of petitioners, legalized torture, systemic extortion. Others happened in a fog of survival. A poor retainer coercing a merchant for a loan to feed his family. Condemning the practice requires describing the practice, not simply assigning character. It demands locating responsibility in institutions and in choices. The human texture matters. When you imagine a samurai at dusk, the scene is not only steel and ink. Picture a narrow room. The man sits cross-legged, his back to a sliding paper screen. Lantern light, makes a small island of warmth. On the table, a ledger with hastily scratched kanji. Outside, a yokel's voice calling for respite in the fields. In the morning, that ledger transforms into an order. The same hand that traces poetry signs a citation. That disjunction is not theatrical irony. It is mundane tragedy. One more frame. The self-legitimation of violence through narrative. Samurai texts and later Bushido manuals provided a script that made violence meaningful. If one must kill, it is for loyalty. If one must die, it is for honor. That script softened the moral consequence for participants and spectators. The rhetoric of honor translated coercion into sacrifice. The rhetoric is performative. It produces meaning and therefore alters behavior. Knowing that is part of reconstructing an honest portrait. The samurai were actors and audience in that drama. Why is this portrait important beyond historical curiosity? Because it disrupts simple moral packaging. When societies package coercion as virtue, they create durable, exportable narratives. The samurai case shows how a local class's administrative necessity became a moral template. That template outlived the class. And the decoupling violence matters on the ground. Ritual matters in the archive teaches an enduring lesson. Moral language can sanitize structural brutality. The final image of this honest portrait is not monochrome. It is a layered etching. A man who could write tender verses and then sign an order. Institutions that needed stability and chose control. A culture that produced beauty and terror in the same breath. The samurai's history is best read not as a fall from grace, nor as a neutral bureaucratic function, but as a human system of power that used aesthetics, law, and ritual to produce obedience. The portrait is unsettling because it refuses closure. It leaves room for empathy without exculpation. Now imagine stepping outside the archive with this portrait in your head. How do you meet contemporary injunctions that borrow samurai language, duty, sacrifice, loyalty, when they appear in political speeches or corporate handbooks? The question reframes past behavior as a living grammar. That grammar still persuades. And that is the hook into what follows. The long thread from rituals and records to the present day, where echoes of samurai organization shape how work, loyalty, and sacrifice are rewarded and punished. We are only halfway through the story. The next part follows the thread into now. The past does not stay past. It leaks. It turns into slogans, office rituals, film scenes, festival programs, and souvenir shops. The echoes of samurai life, its aesthetics, vocabulary, and tactics have threaded themselves into modern Japan and into global culture. To see the thread, look at three overlapping planes: politics and society, religion and ideology, then the commercial and cultural sphere. Each plane shows how a selective past becomes contemporary tool. Politically, samurai rhetoric became a supply of metaphors for national unity. In the Meiji era, the state deliberately repackaged samurai virtues as national virtues. The modern nation needed citizens who would work for the state's economic and strategic goals. Loyalty and discipline were useful. So the state recycled the samurai's language while changing its target. Where once loyalty was to a local lord, it became loyalty to the emperor and to the nation. Textbooks rewrote lineage. Ceremonies borrowed elements that had once been visible only in samurai households. Walk into a public speech in modern Japan, and you will sometimes hear invocations of spirit and duty. They are thin echoes, but audible. Politicians have used the language to ask citizens for sacrifices during crises. We must all hold fast. We must endure. The dramatic effect is powerful because the words carry centuries of moral sediment. You have seen it in disaster speeches and in work culture exhortations. The phrase spirit of self-sacrifice slips easily from history channels into workplace memos. Work culture is where the samurai legacy becomes concrete for many people today. Corporate structures that prize lifelong commitment, conformity, and seniority echo feudal bonds. The old master-retainer relationship morphed into firm worker relationships. Lifetime employment in Japanese corporations was never. It is not identical nor deterministic, but it is a template that can be reused. The cultural and commercial plane is where the samurai myth becomes an export product. Film is the obvious vector. After 1945, Akira Kurosawa and others found ways to tell human stories in samurai settings that emphasized moral dilemmas, loyalty, and heroism. Kurosawa's films are complex and often critical, but they also crystallized a readable, exportable image, the warrior who knows the code. That image fit Western appetites and was easy to translate. The international film festivals, retrospectives, and Hollywood references cemented the samurai as a global signifier of noble discipline. From there, the pipeline widened. Books like Naito's Bushido repackaged samurai ethics for Western audiences at the turn of the 20th century. Naito's book emphasized certain elements: honor, loyalty, self-control, and translated them into bourgeois virtues consonant with Victorian moral economy. It was effective because it smoothed over the messier parts: extraction, coercion, and administration. That smoothing made a marketable brand: samurai ethics. The brand lasted. Games and contemporary media converted the samurai into interactive commodities. Titles like Ghost of Tsushima and Sekiro build immersive fantasies of martial prowess, while selectively referencing historical elements. They are brilliant creative works, but they distill and sanitize. Combat becomes aestheticized. Context is often compressed. Players experience honor as mechanic, a reward system, not a political history. The feedback loop is powerful. Hundreds of hours of polished experience can outstrip the influence of dry archival texts on public imagination. Tourism monetizes the aesthetic too. Castles open for visitors. Armor sits behind glass under soft lighting, and guides tell tales of valor. The Castle Museum offers a texture of beauty: lacquered suits, memorial halls, elegant calligraphy. The tour's itinerary rarely includes the ledger room or the peasant petition file. The experience comforts. It sells. Souvenir shops multiply the effect with miniature armor sets and decorative swords. The economy around nostalgia makes selective memory profitable. Media and market forces thus conspire to naturalize a particular reading of the past. It's not a conspiracy in the grand sense. It's a market logic. Beautiful objects sell better than painful documents. Films that center moral drama over administrative cruelty attract larger audiences. The particular selection bias is invisible. Beautiful things accumulate visibility. Ugly facts accumulate in specialist archives. There is another modern actor: organized crime. The Yakuza package their identity with borrowed samurai tropes, ritual, tattoos, borrowed language of honor. Yet genealogies are more complicated. Yakuza origins trace to Bakudo and Takiya gamblers and peddlers, and their adoption of samurai aesthetics is often strategic. Codes and rituals provide a veneer of legitimacy. The result is a cultural palimpsest: ritualized violence layered on practical criminality, all wrapped in the language of tradition. Education plays a decisive role in anchoring the myth. Textbooks condense. Where a historian can argue nuance over pages, a school chapter offers a tidy narrative that can be recited. Over generations, narrative inertia solidifies a version of the past into received wisdom. Change a chapter, and you alter the mental furniture of an entire cohort. In some cases, textbook revisions have corrected glaring omissions. In many places, however, old narratives persist because they are comfortable. International reception feeds back into domestic image-making. Western appetite for exotic but noble warrior figures encouraged Japan's cultural industries to lean into certain frames. When foreign audiences paid to see samurai films or bought Naito's book, those products gained cultural capital. Economic incentives aligned with cultural ones. Exportability reinforced the selective portrait. So how does the legacy operate today in practical terms? It does three things. First, it provides rhetorical shortcuts, invoking spirit or duty to legitimize sacrifice. Second, it shapes institutional expectations, the corporate, military, and bureaucratic settings that reward loyalty and endurance. Third, it becomes a commodity, tourism, film, games, and brands that sell simplified pasts. The strategic combination makes the legacy durable. This is not to say there are no countercurrents. There are artists, historians, and activists who insist on Messier stories. Documentary filmmakers screen local archives. Teachers introduce primary sources that complicate textbook lessons. Museums stage exhibits that juxtapose lacquered armor with tax rolls. These interventions matter. They interrupt circulation. They create friction. Yet friction does not have the same velocity as polished products. If you are listening, you might ask, what do you do with this? One modest step is curiosity. When a politician says, we must all sacrifice, ask what ledger that call pays into. When a corporate ritual demands loyalty above well-being, ask whose interests are served. When you enjoy a samurai film or game, enjoy it, but keep the historical distance. Savor the art. Do not let it double as your only source of truth. The thread from feudal armory to office memo is not a straight line. It is an accretion. But once you see the accumulation, it becomes harder to accept a glossed past as neutral. The samurai legacy is less about a vanished caste and more about a vocabulary, a set of rhetorical tools that still organize people's expectations and justify certain sacrifices. That is why the story matters now, because what was once a local solution to local problems has become a cultural mold for present choices. There is one final, unsettling corner to examine: the ease with which violence is reframed as noble when it is repeated often enough in images, slogans, and rituals. The danger is not only that the past is lied about, it is that the lie becomes comfortable. We want to keep looking. There are more layers: how archives were curated, which voices were muted, which economies were honored. The next step is to return to the question of authorship. Who writes the history and who benefits when a past is sold as beauty? That question pulls us toward a closing that will not feel comfortable. We began with a brutal image steal in a throat and traveled through the tidy legends, the archival fissures, the backstage engines of power, and the long, deliberate rebranding that turned coercion into culture. The trajectory ends with a single, sharp question, not an answer. When a story of the past is chosen because it comforts those in power, whose interests are being protected by that comfort. If this investigation unsettled you, that was the point. History is not only what happened, it is who decides how we remember what happened. Thank you for staying with this dossier to the end. If you want more of these excavations, more cases where a sanitized past has been sold as virtue, subscribe to help this channel reach its first milestones. Leave a comment. Where did you first learn the version of history you still carry? Name a city or school. Let us map what we were taught and compare it to what the ledgers say. The next file is waiting.